not to turn off your camera if you wanted. So I believe that we are live on Facebook and also live on Zoom. So we'll see some additional people starting to join us on Zoom. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Peace and blessings be upon everybody. Thank you for joining us on your Sunday evening. For many of you, this is your second day of the weekend with CAIR Florida. A lot of you joined us for our Know Your Rights training last night, which we really appreciate and wanted to say thank you very much for doing so. That's our goal. You know, these programs are part of our online virtual programming that we've begun since the start of the COVID pandemic. And we definitely want to be responsive to the community's needs. So please be in touch with us. Let us know the types of workshops and webinars that you're most looking for. And that's what we're here to provide. So tonight we have a really great panel lined up for everybody on an issue that is at the forefront of the discussion everywhere in the country, as it should be. And before we, get started, and before we introduce our great panelists and our moderator, I wanted to just take a minute to really frame our conversation today. I think it's easier in some ways to frame the conversation as what it's not. Right. So this is not a conversation about the history of the fight for racial justice in America. There's many amazing resources out there that we encourage you to go find and to use as a resource to educate yourself and your family and your community. It's also not even really a conversation on, solutions on what we need to be doing right now, because, that CAIR Florida believes strongly is a conversation that needs to be led by and really led by Black leadership in the country, and we need to support and elevate those voices. And in a lot of ways, they have known the solution that we need and for many years, and it's really a matter of us listening to things that have been said for many decades now. So what did we want to do today? Well, what we wanted to do was have a very, the first of many, a beginning, a preliminary conversation from a faith perspective, from a faith lens on what, in our interfaith traditions, what do our faith traditions say about racial equity? Let's answer these questions as a starting point. And one of the things that we just want to point out is that there's many different conversations that need to be had about this conversation on many different levels, right? So this conversation on race equity and racial justice is a conversation that needs to happen within my own masjid, within the rabbi's own community, within the reverend's own community. It has to happen within our own towns, and then it has to happen as a country as well. So we're having this conversation at many different levels, and we have to have ongoing conversations at the same time, right, with different audience members within your own family and then outside of that as well. And so this is the one conversation from the lens of an interfaith perspective. And what's really interesting is that, when you look at the US, the founding of the US as a case study, the United States was founded for religious freedoms, right? And that's also why CAIR Florida was founded, in a nutshell, to protect the right of both Muslims and non-Muslims to be able to practice their faith in this country free of discrimination. And when you look at the US, even though we are very culturally secular country, we are also one of the most religiously diverse countries in the world. And people who identify with a religion in the US tend to take their religions very seriously and tend to be more practicing. And if you look at research from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, or even the Pew Center, you find that religion is very important to many Americans' lives. So I think I was reading that over 36% of adult Americans attend religious worship or once a week, at least once a week. And over 56% of US Americans believe that religion is very important in their lives. And then we know also from further studies that a lot of religious communities tend to be more civically engaged. The more religious you identify yourself as being, the more civically engaged you are and the more involved you are in community affairs. And so, all of that to say that the faith community is a community that also has to be actively engaged in this conversation, in this ongoing conversation on racial justice. And so that's really what we've tried to assemble for you here today is a panel of clergy from different faith backgrounds to hear directly from them, what their faith traditions say on this topic, and to, be able to moderate with facilitated questions to understand better about the different faith groups that are out there as, just a beginning step in this process of conversation, and really making sure that every group is involved in this, ongoing process for justice and equity. So with that, again, I just wanted to welcome everybody and thank you all for being here and introduce our wonderful panel. So we'll go ahead and start the introductions of the panel, and I will allow you to see the amazing lineup that we have for you guys. And also, just as a little bit of housekeeping, if you have any questions at all, please, if you're joining via Zoom.
I've been wanting to do something with you all day.
Sorry, guys, I'm just going to ask everyone to mute if you're not speaking. Thank you. And then also, just to let everyone know, if you have any questions, feel free to please put them in the Q&A box. And if you're joining via Facebook as well, you can add your questions to the comment section. Okay. Let me just make sure everyone's muted here. Okay, wonderful. So our first of the panel that you see, if you have the same order that I do, well, actually, let's go this way. So the first person in the panel that I would like to introduce is the Reverend Russell Meyer. So Reverend Dr. Russell L. Meyer is the Executive Director of the Florida Council of Churches and missional pastor of Lutheran Urban Parish of Tampa. He heads the Florida Faith Advocacy Office and convenes the Florida Interfaith Climate Action Network, which is now planning its 6th assembly. He also serves as a community co-chair of the Suncoast Sea Level Rise Collaborative at St. Petersburg College with the Institute of Strategic Policy Solutions. He is the founder of the Real Talk Coalition for Education, Equity, and Anti-Racism Coach with Black Lives Matters Tampa. Active in state and national climate and moral policy movements, he chairs the local and regional committee on National Council of Churches. His doctoral work is in applying social fields theory to generate conversation among heterogeneous groups that lead to new collaborative action. Try saying that 3 times fast. He is ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and has served churches in New York, Maryland, South Carolina, and Florida. Welcome, Reverend Russell. We are very grateful to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Rabbi Stephen Lewis Fuchs. So Rabbi Stephen Lewis Fuchs was born in East Orange, New Jersey. Being from New York, I have to say that we sometimes have beef with New Jerseyans, but we're gonna let it slide. Upon graduation from high school, he attended and graduated from Hamilton College in Clinton, New York. There you go, he came to New York after all. After 5 more years and 4 summers of full-time study, he was ordained as a rabbi at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he earned his MA in Hebrew letters and a graduate certificate in Jewish communal service for the Hebrew Union College branch in Los Angeles. You guys are really testing me with these bios. In 2011, Rabbi Fuchs began his appointment as president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, and there he travels over 65 communities on 5 continents as a prominent proponent of reform Jewish values and legitimacy. Since 2017, Rabbi Fuchs and his wife Victoria Fuchs currently reside in Sanibel Island, Florida, where Rabbi Fuchs is the spiritual leader of Bat Yam Temple of the Islands. Thank you, Rabbi, for joining us. We're very happy to have you with us. And then our final panelist is ImamAhmed Derrick Peat, who converted to Islam in 2003 and went on to study at the University of Florida, where he graduated with a bachelor's degree in journalism and a minor in Arabic language and literature. In 2010, he was awarded the opportunity to further his study of Arabic and Islamic sciences in Cairo, Egypt, which is a great country, by the way. I'm not biased or anything. But along with a rigorous curriculum of Arabic grammar, morphology, and rhetoric, in addition to Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic creed, and Quranic exegesis at Al-Azhar University, which is a very esteemed university in Egypt. In 2012, he moved to Amman, Jordan, to complete his Islamic studies. His primary focus in private classes were Islamic jurisprudence, Arabic grammar, morphology, and the Islamic creed. In 2017, he was awarded a certificate in Quran and the rendition and its certain rendition of Quran Hafs. And in the same year, he graduated with a bachelor's degree from the World Islamic Education University in Amman, Jordan. And so thank you for joining, Imam. We're very happy to have you with us all the way from Fort Pierce. And finally, that leaves our moderator, Brother Hassan Shibly, who is the Chief Executive Director of CAIR Florida. It's okay, I'm gonna go ahead and shorten your bio, Hassan, because it's very long. But he has been doing civil rights work for over 10 years. Many of you know him. He originally hails from Buffalo, New York, of Syrian descent, and he has lectured regularly on the issues of Islam, Muslim Americans, and civil rights in the US, many occasions. And so with that, we have a great panel set for you with Hassan as well. And we're gonna ask some questions, some facilitated questions, but we wanted to open it up with some opening remarks from each of our panelists, and there will be time for audience Q&A as well. So with that, Hassan, I will turn it over to you to begin the opening remarks for everyone.
Okay, respected colleagues, brothers and sisters, thank you so much for joining us for this critical conversation. And, you know, I think it's a time of learning for a lot of us. For me personally, even as Executive Director of CAIR Florida, it's really a time for listening and change, and being open to listening, learning, and changing. And I'm going to start with the first point of change. You know, when I looked at the program, and unfortunately, we've been so overwhelmed that literally it's day to day in terms of our involvement and program engagement. So when I saw this program just a few minutes ago that the team so wonderfully put together, my first question was, why am I moderating? I would have loved to have some of our Black brothers and sisters from the community in my position. So that's a shortcoming on us. It's a shortcoming on me. And that's, you know, I think we need to be more intentional in how we even have these conversations and who's at the table. But I am grateful for all of you that you are here, and inshallah we'll continue to grow and learn. And honestly, I'm here to listen and learn from all of you and from the audience as well. You know, it's been a very challenging time, and I think our community as the Muslim community, and as I speak on behalf of CAIR, we look to solve the problems of civil rights and injustice and racism. But I think what the conversations of the last weeks have really brought to light is we need to have these conversations internally as we are having them externally. I'm not saying we stop the fight externally until we clean house internally, but I do think we have a lot of work to do internally as well. So with that, I want to welcome our respected guests. My tradition is I'll go in the order that God chose. So we'll start with our respected Rabbi Stephen, if you can start first, and then we'll hear from the Reverend. And then last but not least, our respected Imam, inshallah. You know, God sent Moses, then Jesus, then Muhammad. So we'll follow that order as well. God bless you. And thank you, Rabbi. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hassan. I am very pleased and honored to be with you this afternoon. Over the years, whenever I've had the privilege of dialoguing with Muslim friends and clerical colleagues, I notice they always begin with a prayer. So I will begin with a prayer from the book of Psalms, Psalm number 133, Hinema tovu manaim shevet achim gam yachad. How good, how pleasant it is for us to be together in unity, to listen to each other and to learn from one another. Amen. Jewish tradition is unequivocal about the absolute equality of races. It begins with the very first story in our Hebrew Bible, the story of creation. We are created, all of us, in God's image. And subsequent Jewish tradition, our folkloristic tradition, we call it Midrash, makes very clear two important points. Number one, why did God only create one human being at the beginning, Adam? To teach us all that none of us should ever say, my racial, religious lineage is greater than yours. Number two, we are told that God formed Adam, the first human, from the dust of the earth. And in that regard, Midrash teaches God took earth from all the corners of the earth, brown earth, yellow earth, white earth, and black earth, so that again, we are all coming from the same place. We all emanate from the same common humanity. There is no question that the tradition affirms this unequivocally in the famous verse from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, a cardinal principle of our daughter religions, Christianity and Islam, that we need to have respect for one another. Each one of us is a representation of the divine image. So our ideals are very, very clear. Do we always live up to them? Have we always lived up to them? Absolutely not. And that is the shame that we all share. We might not all be guilty of racism, but we are all responsible for it. Were there Jews involved in the slave trade? Certainly. Were there Jews who were slave owners? No question. Have there been Jews who have been slumlords? Guilty once again. And the list goes on and on. We all have our ideals that we don't always live up to. And that is the task, I believe, of why we are here today. This past week, from the Torah, we read a portion from the book of Numbers called Beha'alotecha, which means when you set up your lamps to illumine your sanctuary. When we set up our lamps to illumine our respective sanctuaries, our hope and prayer will be that we understand that our lamps are not the only lamps. There are many perspectives that are relevant and important and that we should respect. Further, there is the insistence on the pursuit of justice. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice must you pursue. And when you see unequal treatment of Blacks by police, in housing, in job employment, in pay scales, in an ongoing list of injustices, that must be our agenda. And there are those who say, keep religion out of politics. Well, when it comes to justice, I think we have to be engaged in politics, and we have to be on the lookout so that we can truly love our neighbor as ourselves. The only other point I will make at this time does not come from Jewish tradition, but from the 1st century and 2nd century Greek philosopher Epictetus, who taught us something very important. When it comes to this subject in particular, there is a reason that the Eternal One gave us 2 ears, only 1 mouth, so that we could listen twice as much as we speak. And at this time in history, I completely agree with you, Hassan. It is time for us who think we have tried to live our lives on the path of justice to listen very, very carefully to those in the African American community, understand what they need, how they are feeling, and do our best to meet those very urgent needs.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was so beautifully said, such a powerful message. And, truly, truly grateful, in the Islamic traditions, we see ourselves children of Abraham. It's an honor to be part of the Abrahamic faith that has taught such a beautiful and powerful message as represented by yourself just now. And next, I would love to hear from our respected brother and dear friend, the Reverend Russell Meyer. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, CAIR Florida, for the invitation to be with you this evening. Rabbi, it's good to meet you virtually. Look forward to meeting you physically, incarnated, as we like to use in the Christian church. Hassan, my brother, it's good to be with you again. It's good to see you again. It's good to walk with you. We've walked together a couple of times over this past couple of weeks. I want to begin with a poem in progress that I used at yesterday's March for Black Lives. Over 4,000 people estimated marched down Bayshore Drive in Tampa, normally reserved for the route of the Gasparilla Pirates, but there were no pirates. And it goes like this: I am sober, my mind is clear, I am my mother's child, and I am the sibling of every mother's child. I am sober. My mind is clear. I am my mother's child, and I am the sibling of every mother's child. God formed us from earth and breathed spirit into us. Such is life. And so I was so happy to hear Rabbi speak of these verses. Because these verses tell me related to all living things and to one another. That from the perspective of the Creator, we are a singular family on earth, of earth, with earth. And so then the question becomes, well, why have we divided ourselves into some who are superior and some who are lesser? The Christian scriptures, in the writings of the Apostle Paul, Galatians 3:28, make a clear statement about our understanding of one another. Paul is very much taken with the concept that a new humanity has come into being through the one raised from the dead, who we call Jesus. Paul says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. In that teaching, Paul is breaking down all of the primary categories of division that existed in his day, to say that those categories of division, what he in another place calls a wall of hostility, has been torn down, and that there is a new humanity based upon the God of life and not the God of death. And the God of death is the God of this world, the God of the empires. And so the foundation of the Christian faith, of the Christian community, of the church, is originally of one new humanity. And what's new about that humanity is this fundamental understanding that all of the ways in which we had previously divided up humanity no longer count. They do not matter. What matters is a life of shared equity, justice, compassion, love, and well-being. And this message took hold in the Roman Empire like wildfire, particularly among the lowest classes and among the slaves of that day. And we still see this to be the case in how the church grows around the world. It really first finds its fire, its growth among those whom society has pushed to the very margins and has excluded. Because the core message of the gospel is a message of inclusion that is not based upon any human attribute that a person brings to it. It is based upon God's choice for your life and wellness, wholeness, well-being, a choice that we say was declared through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The unfortunate thing is that over the years, when the church was seconded to the powers of the empire and began to receive its sustenance, its physical sustenance from the empire, from society, from worldly goods, it began to adapt the thinking of the empire. It began to create borders in which those who were in and those who were out. And that perpetuated. Though in the opening comments, we heard much made about this being a nation on religious freedom, but we have to be very clear. There were only certain kinds of people whose religion qualified. The non-indigenous people who came to this country, for the most part, practiced genocide of the indigenous people who were here. And they did it based upon their religious convictions. And they completely dishonored the religions of the people who are here. And if you spend any time with Native American or indigenous spirituality, you learn they tell the same story about the creation of humanity in the same framework, right? We're all children of Mother Earth, and our breath comes from the Sky Father, and that there's just human being. There's not different kinds of people. There's just human being. Every indigenous people say we are the people of the earth. But that spirituality was not welcome. And it was rooted out and eradicated by the people who thought that their religion were superior. The fundamental question that we're facing today about racism is a question about the validity of the concept whiteness. There was never a concept of whiteness until the conquest of this hemisphere by Northern Europeans. And in introducing that concept of whiteness, they try to claim a particular divine favor. They spoke about their journey as the new Israel, conquering the old Canaan. They came with a conquest theology, and they considered their way superior. And they allowed other Abrahamic faiths to come along on the journey. But make no mistake about it, they thought of themselves as better than others. Thomas Jefferson spoke of the English language as superior to all of their languages. I don't know, maybe Muslims might take a different approach about language. Maybe Jews might take a different approach about language. But the concept of whiteness was written into our Constitution. It was written into our immigration laws. It was written into our policies. For the first 150 years or so, it was principally white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, WASP. We all remember that term. But then when that demographic no longer held the majority, they broadened the category so that it would then begin to include people from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. And in the last 15 years, they broadened it to include people from North Africa and the Middle East. When they see that their majority is succumbing to the browning of America, as demographers speak about it, they try to broaden the concept of whiteness to retain their power, their domination in our society. And in this larger picture, what we see happening today is people everywhere saying this is a concept that we no longer want to have functional in our society. It was never valid. and it is intolerable. And we must find ways to build an anti-racist society. And as we build an anti-racist society, the concept of whiteness is going to fade away. It's a false concept. It was made up in order to possess this land and dispossess the peoples who were here before we arrived. All of these things are anti-ethical, antithetical to the teachings of the Christian scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures. But that hasn't stopped Christians throughout the history of the United States to find ways to justify their hierarchy over other peoples. And so one of the challenges, particularly that the church has, particularly the so-called white church has, the Black church has been very clear about this from the very beginning. And we have much to learn from them. And I spend as much time as I can with Black church leaders and worshiping with Black Christians. But the white church really is in a position of having to learn really a fundamental new identity about itself. The truth about Christianity in the world today is that most Christians live in the third world and are not white. Northern European descent Christianity is a minority in the church today. But we have the wealth, and we have to learn how to use our wealth with equity and justice rather than with power and domination. And that's a major challenge. And the one other piece that I would say is that the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, are very clear about the presence of the resurrection of Jesus being in the body of believers, into the community of Jubilee, if you will. And that how they live their life together is a walk in a newness of life that's representative of Jesus being present and alive in the world. And we have become a society that's highly individualistic. And we have walked away from the various ways in which we are to be a community of compassion and love, of mutual support and care, not just for our own, but for those who are hurt and who need help and who lack hope in our communities and in our neighborhoods. And so the church is in a journey to really rediscover what the enduring power of the gospel of Jesus is really about. That's a journey that we take to throw off the white power and the white supremacy, the preferential treatment we've given to ourselves over and against others in our law and our custom and our policy and our regulations. And so that, to me, is very much a part of what the walk in the streets are all about in these days. Learning to walk with one another in peace and in solidarity and in unity, so that our love is communal and not simply private.
Thank you for that, Reverend Mayer. A lot to think about, a lot to reflect on, and I know this is quite a deep conversation, especially as it relates in the U.S. with Christianity being the predominant religion, and a lot of times white supremacy being a tool that has misrepresented Christianity and sometimes and created quite a lot of questions, a lot of tension, which we can get into. And, you know, I think a lot of our religions can relate to that. A lot of times our religions have been misused to advance certain financial or political agendas. And in doing so, really be expressed in ways that are completely antithetical, as you mentioned, to the soul of the faith itself. And with that, I would love to welcome our dear respected Imam for his opening remarks as well, inshallah, so we can continue the conversation. Imam Derrick.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulina al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma inna nastahdika li arshadi amrina wa zidna ilman yanfa'una. Alhamdulillah, we begin my opening remarks with, of course, praising Allah, praising God, and giving him thanks for the ability to gather here and to have this sort of discussion, such an important discussion, critical discussion. We believe in the Islamic, the Islamic ethos, the Islamic ethics, that such discussions are critical for healing, and that our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he's sent for such healing. Allah says about our Prophet in the Quran, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, and that we've only sent you, O Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a rahmah, or as a mercy to all the worlds. So this is all the realms of sentient existence. The Prophet is sent as a mercy to mankind and all the different colors of mankind, the different nations, the different tribes. He's sent as a mercy to them. He's sent as a mercy to animals, a mercy to plant life, the plant, the biosphere entirely. The Prophet is sent as a mercy to that. And he's sent as the final prophet with a healing, that he brings this message to really heal the people, to give them something that will be a source of solace and a source of and a means of understanding who they are as children of Adam and also as slaves of God. Allah mentions in the Quran, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qabaila lita'arafu. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, inna allaha alimun khabir. So in this particular verse of Quran, God says in the Quran, "O all of mankind, all together, indeed we have created you as from a male and a female, and have made you nations and tribes that you may come to know one another." So here, God in the Quran, he gives us the wisdom in why we have different races, different nations, different tribes, different sort of people, that we come to know one another, and that there's a divine wisdom in this, and also the purpose of humanity itself is a purpose therein, that we come to know one another. So God is telling us here that we come to know one another, and in that we achieve purpose. In that there is a deep wisdom in coming to know one another. So this verb that God uses here, it actually means to come together in unison and to complete one another. That we come together, we learn from one another, but we also uplift one another. We have this CAIR-FL, or this gnosis, that we achieve by studying one another, understanding one another. We believe that each and every single human being is like a microcosm, or that is a small blueprint for the rest of the macrocosm, the rest of the cosmos altogether. So that when we come together and we learn from one another, we learn from different races, different nations, different tribes, that we effectively, as individual human beings, we complete ourselves a little bit more. We heal ourselves a little bit more. We gain more of that prophetic mercy. We gain more of that, as our Christian brothers would say, grace. We garner that grace of God. As is another statement in Arabic, Yadullahi ma'al jama'ah, that the hand of God is with the group that looks to come together, that looks to coalesce, that looks to come together and reconcile themselves, that supports one another mutually. So these are some immediate things that came to mind. Of course, in the Islamic perspective on these things, that we believe that the core of the human being is the heart, and that the heart will be an indicator of everything that the human being does and a reflection of the human being. And that this is primarily where Allah looks at the human heart. That he doesn't look at the suwar, as we state in Arabic. Allah doesn't look at the different shapes, different sizes. Where are you from? Are you darker skinned? Are you lighter skinned? Rather, Allah looks to our virtue. He looks to our character. And as our Prophet also taught us that he said, I've only been sent to perfect good character. And that anything other than that, this is a thing that's something that threatens humanity. So if we talk about racism, this is something, and everything that we just mentioned previously, that when a person is racist, he's actually really self-hating, if we can understand that. So when a person hates another human being, you're actually hating a piece of yourself. You're hating a member of your extended family. Really, really important for us to understand. So this is the ethical framework that Islam comes with to really to sort of cut the racial issues, to sort of cut the roots and sort of to keep, the enemy of the human being out of the equation, which is of course shaitan. And this is a being that we have to talk about because he is often the source of the dissension, the division, and the racial supremacy and even the white supremacy in the country today. And this is something that we have to call out clearly and be explicit with, that we need to get the devil out of our affairs as human beings, that we have to be a people who take to the prophetic manhaj, take to the prophetic methodology and get the devil out of our affairs. Return to virtue, right? Return to the prophets, return to Jesus, to Moses, and these divine teachings, this compassion, this mercy, and get the devil out of our affairs. Now, so as a people, we have to also mention and recognize more than anything else, as a people, we're hurting. We're hurting, we're suffering as a people. And the suffering, it's apparent on the world stage today that we as a human body, we are suffering, and the soul of the human being, the soul of the collective humanity, it's suffering right now. And it's like, it's gasping for life. And we can see that life when we see people walking on the streets saying enough is enough. Enough is enough. There have been too many Black men who have died in the street unjustly. It's gone on long enough. So what we're seeing here is the human spirit basically still kicking, still wanting to rectify itself, still wanting to go back to the prophetic teachings, wanting to go back to those things that give us life in the first place. So we mentioned, these as opening remarks to sort of set the tone for discussions to come after. Again, I thank you for inviting me, that we can sort of share the Islamic perspective and have, this really, really critical discussion. How do we, and ask the questions, how do we heal as a people? How do we come together? These important questions. And, it's my belief that, through faith, we can solve these things and transcend these affairs. Because our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he comes with the solution to these things. And the prophets within their teachings, they have this shifa, or this healing, that really is a cure to the racial issues, the over racialization that we see in society today, and to the racial supremacy that some people want to espouse. So we ask God for success in these regards, and we ask him for his forgiveness for our shortcomings. Ameen. So no.
Thank you for those powerful remarks. I want to facilitate a conversation between us in the time we have remaining. So very quickly, very bluntly, a lot of times religions have been used to justify and reinforce issues of racism, especially here in the United States. It's not unusual that religion has been abused to justify really bad practices. And how can we, as in a practical sense, leverage our faith, our spirituality, our community to be part of the solution, not part of the problem? What are some practical steps that we can all take? And again, I'll start with the rabbi, then the reverend, and then the imam. And let's try to keep the remarks to 3 minutes, inshallah, in the time remaining, so that we can have a conversation amongst the three of us, or the four of us. Rabbi, I think you're muted.
I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
Number one, listen. As I said earlier, we have to listen more, talk less. We need to hear the pain of the other. The 20th century Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas said that we see the face of God. The scripture makes very clear God is invisible. So when we talk about the face of God, what do we mean? Levinas said we see the face of God in the face of the other. And when we truly are willing to look at and listen to the face of the other, we begin to make that journey toward racial justice, or to the ideals expressed in our own Pledge of Allegiance, a land of liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Reverend?
Well, I will say from my own experience, the most powerful thing we can do is to be found in public together.
Mm.
And there are just multiple experiences that I have had throughout my 25, almost 30 years here in Florida, in which coming together, Black and white clergy, interfaith gatherings, being found in public together, in public spaces, standing shoulder to shoulder, arms locked together, being found in public together, letting that be reported, letting our elected officials see that, is one of the most powerful things that we can do to really encourage and nurture the transformation our society desperately needs. And when we are only preaching truth, God help us to preach truth, but when we're only preaching truth to our own community in this multicultural, this pluralistic society, that's not enough. We have to be caught together, demonstrating how a pluralistic democracy actually functions as a way of supporting my neighbor's faith.
Powerful. And Imam?
Yeah. So I think one of the primary things we can do initially is, of course, educate ourselves. To read about the history of this country. Of course, some of the things are not so easy to read and digest, but we have to read, we have to educate ourselves. The second thing I think immediately we can do is teach our congregations compassion, empathy, teach ourselves, teach our communities not to be judgmental, to see past the sort of, the wrapper of things, so to speak, to see past the stereotypes, to really understand why people, live in a certain way, or they live in certain areas, and so on and so forth, that we study the history of a people. We study the history of the United States to educate ourselves, but then teach compassion in response to that. Teach compassion and teach empathy. Right? Sometimes in faith communities, sometimes we can become judgmental. We could become holier than thou. We can feel like we're superior to that person because he doesn't follow my faith. Rather, when the reality of that of arrogance, that it's the antithesis to faith. Right? It runs counter to faith. So I think teaching compassion, teaching empathy, and teaching love, teaching mercy. This is what the prophets, they come with. This is what religion comes with, and it's us as human beings who come after, who then change things and sort of just to say it straight, make things up. And we hurt ourselves a great deal in regards to this. And we hurt ourselves in our own humanity, even our collective humanity is greatly harmed by us really just making things up and turning religion into something that's really not. So I'd say those are some immediate things that we can do.
Thank you. And with this question, I do want to encourage the audience, and Rania, if you can look out for audience questions, and then feel free to jump in. So we do want the audience to take advantage and ask questions. But I will ask one final question from my end, and that is, and I'm going to start with Imam Derrick on this, and that is, the truth be told, as people of faith, as people of civil rights, as people of social justice, that I think many of our audience are, we have this idea that, we are allies and advocates against injustice, against racism. But I think with a lot of the conversations that have been happening, you realize that, sometimes we can be inadvertently adding to the problem, or we're not being allies in the right way. And I think from what I've seen, there's those who aren't even aware of their shortcomings, but even from those that are aware of their shortcomings, I think that the struggle becomes whereby people are afraid that we may be either be doing too little in terms of supporting the fight against racism and injustice, or sometimes actually doing too much, occupying space and drowning out voices and taking space at the table where others perhaps are better suited. And sometimes I think from people that are sincere between the two, we're struggling. Are we doing too much or doing too little? How do we navigate? So my question bluntly is, how can people be better allies for the African American community in the US, and how can we find balance and do so in a way that's complementary and not just optical support, but true, genuine support that's meaningful for our African American brothers and sisters, regardless of their faith. So I'll start with Imam Bilal and we'll work our way back.
Yeah, so I think one of the immediate things that we can do is to, as the Reverend was mentioning, it's to have presence, to be present there in those communities, to represent, to show that we're here, we're at the table, we want to engage, right? So for example, not necessarily, it's not to insinuate that, that Black people are always from the poorer communities, but in any impoverished community, if that's a Black community, then have, make the presence felt that we are here and we want to do what we can to connect with you and assist you in any way we can. So, and the Islamic, Islamic sort of perspective is that, the basis of our religion is really khidmah. It's just to serve the people. We look to serve, so we can, set up soup kitchens, to set up, any social welfare programs, scholarships, for example, that we as faith leaders, we can have scholarships for example, there's a predominantly Arab mosque in South Florida. And one of the things that they've done to sort of contribute to the surrounding area, because it's in a predominantly African-American community, they've set up scholarships for people going to college, either at FAU or UCF, and they've set up scholarships. And this is a means of showing that we are here to stay, one thing, but also here to care, to show compassion, to show that we care and that we are a part of this community and we want to also welcome you. There's an open door policy. So I think that presence and being there to express compassion and love and mercy, these things are critically important.
Very good. Jazakallah khair. And Reverend?
Well, I would just like to first underline the call to empathy that the Imam has issued, and the exhortation to listening that the Rabbi has issued. As a former ethics teacher, I very much appreciate the writings of Levinas and seeing God in the other, of coming to know the mystery of life in the otherness of the other, that somehow is a window on the mystery of God in our lives as well. I have found that it's very important to establish relationships with those who are unlike me and do everything I can to sustain those relationships over a long period of time. And if God is willing, they are true friendships, right? But to understand that we must live out a relational economy. We cannot give in to the demands of the world to make everything transactional. Whether we're in our house of worship, in our community of faith, or on the street or at work, the quality of the relationships we have with the people that we regularly live life with is extremely important. It's where the profundity of our faith comes forth and where we really get to learn. We have the gift of plurality here in Florida. And most of us in our everyday life, if we are intentional about creating relationships with people who are unlike ourselves, God will do amazing things in and through us. And we have to be willing to submit to the journey God is calling us on as we live out our lives in the plurality that is now Florida.
Wonderful, thank you. And Rabbi?
Thank you. 2 points. One, we need to acknowledge our failures. Very important. We have been remiss For me, my writings deal with scriptural interpretation, and my mantra is that the truth of biblical stories is not in their historicity or in their scientific veracity, but in the lessons we learn from the stories. And just this past week in synagogues around the world, we read a story of how Miriam and Aaron, brother and sister of Moses, uttered a racial slur. They criticized Moses because he had a black wife. And God immediately calls them out into the public sphere. Petach Ochel Moed, the doorway of the tent of meeting where everybody could see, to rebuke this unacceptable behavior. And if we can acknowledge that even our heroes are capable of dastardly utterances and evil acts, then we have to look deeply into ourselves and find our own, atone for them, and resolve not to repeat them. I also want to underscore the point that both Reverend Meyer and Imam Peat have mentioned about presence. I remember 5 years ago in 2015, an African-American pastor in Hartford, with whom I've had several dealings, said, "We're having a commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian massacre, and we need you there." I said, of course, I would love to come. Unfortunately, my car's in the shop. I can't make it. And I'll never forget what she said. "We'll pick you up," because presence, and presence on behalf of the other, is, as my colleagues have said, is absolutely crucial.
Powerful, powerful. You know, I see a lot in alignment, and I think a lot in terms of how we have been working together over the years. You know, as Reverend Mayer mentioned, you know, we walked together multiple times this week and throughout our lives here in Florida, standing in solidarity to not tell people what our faith is not, but to show them what it's about through genuine service and struggling together to advocate for the rights of all people, regardless of their race or their religion. And with that, I see it's almost 6 o'clock, so our time is running short. We could speak a lot, and I want to connect with all of you offline to see what we can do on a more practical level to continue the conversation. And this is the main message I want to emphasize for all of you: is find ways to continue these conversations offline and make it a priority to have these conversations with your friends, with your family. How can we leverage our faith, our community, to uphold justice, to stand up against racism, to stand up for Black lives, to stand up against police brutality? And how can we leverage our resources and our influence to make the world better for all, especially the African-American community, especially as it relates to issues of civil rights, especially as it relates to issues of racism. So with that, I do want to ask you all for sort of 1 minute closing remarks. And we'll start with Reverend Mayer, and then Imam Derrick, and we'll end with the Rabbi. Reverend Mayer, 1 minute closing remarks.
I deeply believe that those of us who now live in Florida today are being presented with an opportunity to show the rest of the nation what it means to live in solidarity, in plurality, in mutual support, in unity and well-being for the other, for the neighbor who is not like me in heritage or in faith, but nonetheless is my brother and sister, because of we are all children of God. We're a common humanity. And as the great Christian mystics used to say, either all of humanity is saved or all of us are lost. And so let's take this journey with joy and expectation and continue our walk together.
Beautiful.
Bismillah. So, in closing remarks, I'd say I'd call to mind a pact which our Prophet, peace be upon him, made in pre-Islamic Arabia. It was called the Hilf al-Fudul. This was the Pact of Virtue. And I'd mention this Pact of Virtue because these virtues that we all used to hold sacred, we still hold them sacred by way of the Constitution. These are now being trampled underfoot. And I'd say as a human race, we have to make a concerted and a united sort of movement back to these virtues, back to these higher virtues. And it's important that we take these things seriously, and that we have a dislike in our hearts when we see these virtues being thrown by the wayside, because these virtues represent really the identity of this great country of ours. They represent the higher virtues of this country, and these things these are things that we have to look to preserve and make a movement back to. Right, amongst these virtues in the Hilful Fudul, this pact that our Prophet made, are one of the primary things that any person who is suffering injustice, then the entire society has to be in unison against that justice. And we hear echoes of this within the Constitution, that the venture for liberty and justice for all. This is something that we have to stand for, and we have to stand against those people who aim to undermine this or subvert it. All right, so we have to stand as a people, stand against those people who look those and these higher virtues as stated in the Constitution and as stated in all of our faiths. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam. And Rabbi?
The reason I was eager to accept the invitation was to learn from my colleagues and to create a partnership between like-minded individuals in our own social action committee here at Bat Yam Temple of the Islands that has been working tirelessly over the last couple of weeks to see how can we take advantage of this moment, because this is a unique moment. The horrible death of George Floyd has galvanized the country in a way that it has not been up to this point. And there is no question, and we've all said this, racism is antithetical to the American creed, but it is an integral part of the American DNA. And this moment gives us the chance to uproot it, to take it and cast it aside to the dung heap of history with the proclamation that we make as one united humanity. We can do better, and we will do better.
Well, this is really, I think that what we had today is just a small teaser, a small appetizer, and just an example of what we can do. There's a lot of forces in the media and elected officials and politicians that want us to believe that we cannot have these conversations, that a Jewish leader, a Muslim leader, a Christian leader cannot have constructive conversations about how we can work together to fix our nation's problems, that in fact we are each other's enemies. There are truly elected officials in the highest offices today who want us to believe that we are enemies of each other based on our race, based on our religion. And I think this is a powerful testament that such divisive rhetoric is false, and that together we can present a solution to these problems. Clearly, we don't have time to, map out practical, actionable plans, in this short 1 hour conversation. But I do believe that at least all of us coming together is a testament that we have strength together, and that those who are trying to divide our nation based on race and religion by tearing each other down, clearly they are on the wrong side of history. And I hope now that we've gotten a small appetizer, a small taste of the kind of beautiful dialogue we can have, we continue these conversations offline. So I personally am committing and looking forward to committing these conversations with my fellow panelists offline and to turn it into something, inshallah, actionable. And I encourage all of you to continue these conversations together within your communities, and go outside of your normal circles, go outside of your normal ethnic groups, your religious groups, to continue these conversations. And let's work together to make this nation a better place for all humanity. Thank you, and God bless you all, and peace be with you all. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.